Welcome to the Urbanist Agenda, the podcast that paints its own bike lanes. I'm joined today by John, Bike Curious. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me again, Jason.
Yeah, so we were chatting online about stuff, and one of the things that came up was this idea of tactical urbanism, or guerrilla urbanism as it's sometimes called. And we were talking a little bit about examples that I've seen in Toronto, and you've certainly seen in San Francisco and in other places. And I thought, you know what, this would be a great topic to talk about on the podcast, because I think this might be something that people aren't so much aware of. So why don't you introduce what we're talking about here? What do we mean when we say tactical urbanism or guerrilla urbanism?
Yeah, so tactical urbanism and guerrilla urbanism specifically is something that I've started to notice a lot more in the last 5 years.
Right.
And it's basically when the community, people, citizens of a city get together, they decide oh, this is a piece of infrastructure that sucks, we want changed. And they see that the city has acknowledged that those changes need to be made, but they don't see any progress happening. So they just take matters into their own hands, basically. They do what they can on their own.
Right. They just do it themselves. Yeah. And this works sometimes. Sometimes it works very well. Sometimes it doesn't work so well. But that's what we're here to talk about. Now, I do want to separate a little bit out. Tactical urbanism is sometimes used in an official capacity. So this is where cities, it's tactical within the city, because even within a city, there are people who want to see changes and there are people who don't really care or have other things to worry about. And I've seen this, for example, in Toronto, where even the cycling department at the city of Toronto, they really want to see things happen, but they're on a shoestring budget, they're very short-staffed, et cetera, et cetera. And so sometimes they look tactically to say, well, what can we do? Can we put some plastic sticks here? Can we put some planters there? They're looking for quick wins, if you will. And that certainly does exist. I know Mayor Sadiq Khan in London and the mayor of New York as well, they've had some success with these kind of things. Times Square, closing it to cars, just plopping down some planters and stools and things like that. And you love to see that, although it always kind of makes me sad because I'm really? You can go spend $100 million on some new traffic lights and stuff, but then we're stuck with planters and paint.
Yeah, it's never too many billions when it's a highway expansion project through your city, right?
I know there's a term called bike shedding, which is funny because we're talking about bikes here, which is a term that came out of the UK when they were doing planning for things. If things were big and expensive and complicated, there were no questions about it at all. But if things were small and well understood by everybody, then they would deliberate on it for hours. And it was called bike shedding because there was this fellow who was involved in planning around nuclear reactor in the United Kingdom. And so when they were talking about doing anything related to the reactor, it was just millions and billions being thrown around all over the place. But then when they talked about building a bike shed for the workers to park their bikes so that it wouldn't get wet, suddenly everyone's does it have to be a metal roof? Could we maybe save some money here? And he's we spent an hour talking about the bike shed. And meanwhile, it's here's 100 million pounds for this and that and everything else. So
classic.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of bike shedding going on. But also, yeah, the money flows easily when it's cars and everyone's suddenly really concerned about the cost when it's bikes.
Mm-hmm.
So nothing gets done. And then what do people do? They do it themselves. So you've got some examples of this.
Yeah, totally. And I guess starting off slow, there's a group here in San Francisco known as Safe Street Rebel.
Yeah.
They're in the social medias from time to time. I think they're most popular for their Week of Cone campaign, where they put traffic cones on the hoods of self-driving cars to disable them.
I still love that so much. It's so funny.
It's great. That got millions and millions of views on social media and really blew up. It also kind of indirectly led to the suspension of Cruise's license to operate self-driving vehicles in California. There's not a straight line between the two of them, but definitely those two things happened within, a few months of each other, not coincidentally.
And we talked about this before on our episode about self-driving cars and the problems that they're going to cause. Cruise created its own problems, running over that woman and then continuing to drive with her under the car. But you can listen to that episode if you'd like to hear more. But yeah, I think, as we said in that episode, people realized just how dumb those self-driving cars were when they just couldn't drive with a cone on their hood. They just didn't know what to do.
Yeah, it really brought light to not just how bad the situation was, but also how disapproving the general public is of the self-driving cars.
Right.
I think that was helpful. But not everybody has self-driving cars in their city. So I think one of my favorite things that the Safe Street Rebel community has been responsible for is building benches at bus stops.
Oh, yeah.
One of my good friends who's been on the stream before, his name's Ming Wei. He's one of the Safe Street Rebel community members that I know. And he and a few other people have been working to build benches and put them around the East Bay at bus stops that don't have somewhere to sit. And the kind of origin story of this is Daryl Owens, who's kind of Twitter famous here in the Bay Area for his housing takes and transportation commentary and stuff like that. He would walk by this bus stop every day in Berkeley and see one of his neighbors, who is an elderly gentleman in his, 70s or 80s. And he didn't have anywhere to sit at the bus stop. And he had just had knee surgery. And so he had to kind of find a seat at the curb, essentially with legs in the street, because he couldn't stand because of his surgery.
That's awful.
Yeah, it's truly terrible that is the current situation for many bus riders all over the East Bay and in San Francisco with nowhere to sit.
Yeah.
And so Mingwei and Daryl Owens decided to kind of take this into their own hands. They built a bench and they researched how to actually install it into the concrete at the sidewalk there.
Nice.
And that was the first bench that they installed. The guy who had the knee surgery and was sitting on the curb got to sit there and talk to Daryl and Mingwei and was so appreciative of what they had done. And I think in this particular case is quite successful. I don't believe that the city of Berkeley has removed any of the benches that have been installed,
Right.
but they're also not going on a big campaign of installing benches on their own either. So that's, I think, something that, a person could go out and install a bench somewhere and it's going to be non-controversial and pretty low key, probably pretty easy to do, but also has a big impact on the people who use it.
Yeah, certainly the guy who can finally sit down after his knee surgery is going to appreciate that.
Yes.
Wild. Absolutely wild. It just does frustrate me so much that cities don't care about people who aren't in cars so often. It's such a common story, which is, again, where this comes from. And so I know in Toronto, for example, that there were places where the bike lane would just end. And it wasn't for any good reason. It just ended. There was still room. And so they would go out and they would paint their own bike lanes. And sometimes that would work. It was a stopgap and the city comes in and installs themselves. Other times they come and wash it off with some bullshit reason that it's, not the right approved kind of paint or something like that. And I'm like, come on, guys. Really?
Yeah, didn't go through the community review process.
Yeah, right.
The community has spoken and they want a bike lane here.
Yeah, exactly. They want a bike lane. Can we please just put a bike lane in here? Yeah. But, before we go too deep into some of those examples, there was one that I put here in the notes that I really wanted to talk about because this happened while we were living in the UK, this guy in Manchester. And it's interesting because this is actually a car example, right? Some cities are so broke that they can't even properly maintain their car infrastructure, as I've experienced every time I go back to Canada and see the state of the potholes. Oh my God. How are the potholes in San Francisco and the Bay Area?
Yeah, our roads are not that smooth. I think that's one thing to Europeans that might come to San Francisco and ride a bike is they'll find that the road conditions a lot worse than they expect. But Oakland is horrible. They're notorious for having very uneven road surfaces. And it's definitely a factor of how much more car dependent Oakland is, and it also having its own kind of struggles that it's going through.
Yeah, Oakland has been struggling for a very long time, even when I lived there in the late 90s, actually. So that's kind of sad that it's still like that, but I guess that is the way it is. I've talked about this briefly in some videos, but I love it. The Canadians are always like, the potholes are bad because we have winter here. And I'm like, okay, well, look at San Francisco, dude. It's always winter. It's always the excuse for Canadians. But the truth is that potholes happen when you have too many cars, too many heavy trucks, and you don't seal the roads and maintain them properly, which is the real issue. But this example here in Manchester is this fellow had potholes all over his road, and he had called the council many times to get them to do something about it, and nobody was fixing the potholes. So finally, he went out with a spray can and started spray painting penises around all of them. And he called himself Wanksy. and every time he painted a penis around a pothole, it got fixed within about 24, 48 hours. So,
tactical urbanism doesn't require the British sense of humor, but it definitely helps.
It helps, right? It helps. And it certainly makes for a good news story. And I think this is one of these things is that if you can do this in a funny or interesting way and it makes the news, it also makes the city look really incompetent and they want to do something about it, right? Because then, and again, from my experience in these cities, there are people who care and want to do something. They just have no resources at all to do anything with it. And so there's these people who do want to go out and fix things and do want to go out and make things better, but they're just not getting any support from the rest of the organization. And when the press is out there and it's something that just makes them look like complete incompetent fools, suddenly the money and resources flow down to that department very quickly, and they can act quickly because a lot of the time, again, in my experience, at least in Toronto, for example, the cycling department, they know what to do. They know what should be done. They know a lot of the things. They're ready to go. They just don't have the money or the resources.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, when the higher ups are made fun of, suddenly things get done.
Yeah, or they don't. I don't know.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay. We'll get to that.
Yeah, well, there's a case. So I think one of the things that's interesting about that is like the kind of demonstration aspect of the guerrilla urbanism.
Yeah.
Because I do think that you can kind of bucket guerrilla urbanism into like whether it's a demonstration or whether it's really just supposed to fly under the radar and just be like a general quality of life improvement for the neighborhood.
Yeah.
I think along the lines of that sort of demonstration methodology is there was a demonstration that Safe Street Rebel did a couple months ago on Franklin Street here in San Francisco, which is like a 3-lane wide, like very, not the whole thing, but a lot of it's 3 lanes wide, very fast moving traffic, all one way, if I remember correctly. I believe it is. And there was a very unfortunate incident like 2 years ago in front of a school where a teacher was hit and killed by a driver. It's like absolutely tragic situation. And the city vowed to, make changes to the intersection to make it safer, because obviously kids are crossing this intersection all the time. Teachers are there.
Right.
Anybody who's living in the neighborhood trying to get to the school has to cross this intersection, which is inherently dangerous. There was no action on this for 2 years. The city did nothing. There were no changes. And Safe Street Rebel put together a campaign to kind of draw attention to this. So like a bunch of the community members were up at like 3 a.m. with soft hit posts, and they drilled like, 20 or 30 soft hit posts into Franklin Street on this particular block down the length of the entire block, completely removing 1 lane of traffic as a traffic calming measure.
Right.
And news crews showed up the next day to like show what had been done and interview Walk SF, a more above board advocacy group that was talking about the changes. And you can see in the news footage that drivers are going super slow through there. It's super safe. Everything's like way better than it was before, or like, 24 hours before that. The conversation, of course, with the news is about the legality of drilling those posts into the ground. And then, of course, the city comes in just a few hours later and removes them all. And we haven't had anything since then. This was months ago and there's been no changes. So, that's more of a demonstration than it really is about expecting the infrastructure to actually change.
Right. But at least it got the press to shine a light on it for a short amount of time.
Yeah. And it's such a no-brainer situation, right? Like you've got a school, you've got speeders, you have an actual fatality. Like this is a terrible idea. We need to fix this. And, the city does nothing. That's incompetence. We need to draw attention to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, man. I saw stuff like that happen in Toronto all the time. They had this horrific system that I think I've talked about in an earlier video called the warrant system, which basically warrants any change made to the street. The warrant system is this super complicated bullshit process where you step through this flow chart of all these things. It's like, what's the car volumes? How many pedestrians are there? What's the potential fatality rates and all this garbage? And it's like, again, like whenever it's cars, the money just flows like crazy. And whenever it's anything else, it's, oh, well, I don't know about that. I don't know, and you literally need people to die for anything to get done. And then in some cases, someone does die and still nothing gets done. And I've seen that happen as well, which is just absolutely pathetic, which is exactly where I am very much in favor of guerrilla urbanism in these cases, because come on, what are we doing?
Yeah, what are we?
And it's not expensive, right? That's how these people can do it by themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it is a community-led movement, right? And it's not like funded by big companies or anything like that. What these people are doing on the streets is illegal. Like nobody wants to touch that officially. And yet they're still able to scrape together the money to create real changes, put a planter down, paint some curbs red to improve daylighting. These kinds of things actually really make a difference and don't cost that much.
Yeah, and I get that like cities sometimes have to buy higher spec stuff than you're getting from your Home Depot for your guerrilla urbanism. Like it needs to be out there, it needs to last 20 years or something like that. So, fine. It's not necessarily as cheap as it is the guerrilla version, but it's still not expensive. None of this stuff is expensive.
One thing on that line that I would like to stress, though, is that at least here in San Francisco, the Safe Street Rebel community is very diligent about doing their research. Like they know the manual of uniform traffic control devices, like they know which type of paint it is and where to source it. And they like know where to get the soft hit posts from that the city uses.
Right.
Like they've like figured out all these things, like which tool, like which specific impact drill do you need to get like a screw 3 inches into the concrete? Like these are things that guerrilla urbanists research for fun.
And those soft hit posts are not expensive at all. They call them flexi posts in Canada. If someone's listening and doesn't know what we mean, but it's those sticks. They're just plastic sticks that can be knocked over and then they'll come back up. I have my own issues with those when they're done by the city, but they are certainly better than nothing. And the one bonus is that emergency vehicles could just run them over on purpose and get to where they're going.
Yeah. In theory, they should be pretty non-controversial.
Yeah, in theory. The only issue is that sometimes they are used where concrete should have been used instead.
Yeah, I guess that's the controversy is that they don't actually protect bicyclists.
Yeah, and that's my major issue with the flexi posts is that, they are great. They are quick. They are cheap. Fantastic. And I have seen this done properly in Toronto where the city will come with the flexi sticks. And for example, they'll make a crossing distance shorter for pedestrians by bumping out the curb with the flexi sticks, for example. And that's great if they do it, because it's like, we're going to do this. It's going to be done next year or 2 years from now when we do this other project. In the meantime, we're going to do this with flexi sticks and then properly do it 2 years later.
Yeah.
My biggest issue is when they do it with flexi sticks and 10 years later, it's still there with flexi sticks and they're all run over it.
That's interesting. Like San Francisco also, as like the city, I guess you could kind of call this tactical urbanism, is like we have a quick build program that the SFMTA can use. It basically, under certain circumstances, the city is given kind of de facto permission to make quick changes or quick iterations to streets. But the reality of it is like a quick build project takes 2 years and, we might put down some soft hit posts with the idea that we might build a curb there someday. I've just never seen it happen. So.
Well, admittedly, in Toronto as well, it is more common that it doesn't happen than it does. But I have seen it happen a couple of times. Do you have more examples for us from San Francisco before we move on?
Oh, yeah, I have a bunch of examples.
All right, let's go through some of these. I think people would be interested in this because I do want people listening to think, well, maybe there's something that I can do myself in my city. What stuff has worked, what stuff hasn't. And odds are there's probably, if you live in a medium to large city, there's probably people doing this already out there.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's actually an important point that I wanted to talk about, which is community. Yeah. And maybe we touch on it a little bit later. We can talk more about the actual infrastructure,
we'll get it on a bit later.
Community is a big part of it, of course. Yeah, here in San Francisco, the Safe Street Rebel crew, some just like really small stuff they do is they're able to make like pretty good bus stop signs. It turns out not all the bus stops in San Francisco have clear, easy to read signage about like which buses stop in a given location.
Right.
It's actually, as a local, like if I'm in a neighborhood I'm not in that often, I sometimes don't even know when I'm like looking straight at a bus stop because they're not clearly marked.
That's so frustrating.
Yeah, it really is. And Safe Street Rebel observed this and the frustration around it. And they created a way to easily print more of these bus stop signs with all of the necessary information on them. And you can see them around. I did a stream last year with Mingwei, and he showed us some of the work that Safe Street Rebel has been doing. And these bus stops were like a big part of it. So I think that's a small kind of low-hanging fruit thing that a lot of cities probably struggle with, just having adequate signage for public transit that is easy and approachable.
Do they follow the same design guidelines that the city does for their bus stops, or do they do something that's improved? Because I've seen that happen as well, where they have signs that are like actually a better design, more clear than what the city provides.
I love that. That's a really good question. I know that some people at Safe Street Rebel are web developers, and they were able to use the APIs that SFMTA exposes about bus stops to like pull in data. So you put in a stop number and it'll render for you the whole sign on a web page.
That's brilliant.
It's so good. Yeah. And it's awesome. And you can do it for any bus stop in the city, which is so cool. I don't know if the design that they use is the same exact design as the SFMTA, though I'm inclined to say that it is. And they're like basically indistinguishable when you see them on the street.
Right. Interesting. Improvements are always welcome, though, if you are doing this, because I know there are graphic designers out there who will do a better job of what the city has put up.
Yeah, for sure. I also wanted to mention, a lot of the improvements that probably we'll talk about today and that we do talk about are about bike infrastructure.
Right.
Like putting soft hit posts down to kind of formalize bike lanes that are already there, or maybe even just painting new bike lanes. It's a pretty common one. But, a lot of times people view the bike community as being like a fringe interest group. Whether or not that's true, obviously debatable, but this is definitely like part of the backlash. And so like a kind of a way around this is focusing on transit and pedestrians, like those are not seen as fringe groups. Everyone's a pedestrian sometimes. Even if you drive, you have to park somewhere and walk.
Right.
And so I think another really big one is crosswalks. There's the Crosswalk Collective in LA. That was a big inspiration for Safe Street Rebel and the work that they do. They'll just go to intersections that don't have crosswalks and they'll paint them. You just need white paint and some like reflective powder, like an hour or so, and you can get a crosswalk in.
Right.
And there was something else I wanted to say about that, but we'll edit this out, so it doesn't matter.
Or not, I don't know.
Or you can turn me into the joke there, no big deal.
You're welcome to look at the show notes anytime you want, though, the document that we have there. Yeah, and I've seen the bit. Actually, this reminds me now, there was this park in Toronto that had an area from the parking lot and the sidewalk that went down into the park, and like people were having to go down this hill and it was very inaccessible. And some guy came out and just said, like, you know what? I'm a carpenter. I'm just going to build the stairs. And he just full on like built the stairs going down the hill. And then this whole hand wringing from the city being like, well, I don't know if this is safe and if people fall off this and who's liable for it and all this stuff. And yeah, I got that. But at the same time,
who's liable when someone slips and falls down the hill?
Exactly. Right. So it's kind of like, yeah, I get that. But can you guys just build some freaking stairs here? Like, yeah, that's the way these things go so often.
And then I know I mentioned just like a quick list. I know I mentioned before, but planters are awesome. You can just put them in streets. A bucket with like a 4x4 post in it filled with concrete. You could put any kind of sign on that you want. And I know that in San Francisco, that's been used to demarc the network of slow streets that we had added after 2020.
Right.
So there's lots of like little things that people can do just to kind of formalize what's already there, or to kind of maybe bend the rules a little bit about what they want.
Right. Or even to connect some of the gaps in these things, like the slow streets, to be like, you know what, this should be a slow street too, because it's in between these two.
Yeah.
That reminds me, though, again, of something that's tangential to this. Another thing that I saw in Toronto back in the day was guerrilla gardening, where they would take like areas of the street that just had no greenery at all, and they would literally just dig it up and put some plants in there and just go along and plant anything, flowers, small trees, anything like that. When you get these parts of the city that'll have like an empty lot with just nothing on it, they just go in and they would garden it. They'd clean up the trash. They'd plant a bunch of plants, and, it would look nicer.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about that at all, like leading up to this conversation, but that's such a good point that like guerrilla urbanism or tactical urbanism isn't just about like street safety and transportation infrastructure and stuff. It's about improving the city in general. Another community that we have here in San Francisco that's along the lines of the guerrilla gardeners, which we do have a guerrilla gardening community, of course.
Of course you do.
Follow SF in Bloom on Instagram. They do wildflower planting around the city.
Oh, that's great.
But we also have the yarn bombing community. Have you heard of this at all?
Okay, yarn bombing is new to me, so tell me about this.
This one's great. It's the knitting community. You think that these people are like really boring, but it turns out they're super punk rock.
Amazing. I love it.
And what they'll do is they'll knit like basically just like a flat kind of, I don't even know what to describe it as because I'm not like a knitter. A square of knit material, fabric. I don't know if it's fabric, kind of like a flat sweater. And what they'll do is they'll go find like a tree, or they'll find like a stop sign, or, well, not the sign, but like the post, signpost, lamppost, things like that. They'll wrap it around and then they'll knit it on the seam to completely knit it around whatever object it is. And then they'll just leave it there as like an art piece.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's so cool. And they'll do like really beautiful designs, bright colors, whatever it is. And they'll just decorate the city with it. But some of them are actually functional. Like there's a yarn bomber for a while that was going around that was putting yarn wraps on all the like bike lockup positions that we had. So when you're locking up your bike, you don't knock it against the hard metal.
Oh,
instead,
nice.
Your bike is protected from the thing you're locking against by the yarn bombing activity. So, that was one of my favorite tactical urbanist moves right there.
I love stuff like that. Like, honestly, obviously, having safer streets is very important, but it's also important just to have a city that's nice. This is something that people who drive around all the time don't really notice because they're moving too fast to even notice or care. But when you're walking through the city, You immediately notice this stuff. You notice like that bit of sidewalk that's broken. You notice that empty lot. You notice all of these things. And people that want to make it prettier, that's important too.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, what else you got for me, John?
I wanted to also talk a little bit about community building because, like,
Yes.
tactical urbanism doesn't happen without a community. I mean, like, I suppose you could go out with like a spray paint can in the middle of the night and like spray stuff. But the
Yeah,
reality
these
is,
aren't often things that one person does. That's one
yeah,
thing to keep in mind. When this happens, it'll happen overnight, and a group of like 15 people will come out and they'll all do it together.
and everybody has different jobs, like you've got like painting, you got people on the lookout. There's a whole thing. And actually, Safe Street Rebels somewhat formal in their organization because they have like an operational security advisor and they have like different roles to ensure that the community stays safe and stays active and stays focused on like the right things.
That's amazing.
So community building is super important. And far and away, I think the best way to build community is to, at least with this community, is to host group rides. The Safe Street Rebel community does what they call slow street, slow rides, roughly once a month, maybe once every other month. And it's usually 50 or 60 people, some music, bikes. It's in the afternoon. I've done them on my stream a whole bunch of times when they're on a Sunday.
Yeah,
I
I've seen
try
that.
to show up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just an opportunity to get the community together. And, a lot of the people that show up could be the people that are participating in these tactical urbanist kind of actions out in the city and, making infrastructure improvements, et cetera. But not everybody is.
Right.
It's a lot of just people who are, on the mailing list or just love bikes or just love to be part of that community. And that's how the community kind of grows and stays cohesive is those social bonds really, they encourage us to help one another out and to protect each other and things like that. So important.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is good that you brought that up. I know we talked about that before, the importance of that. Absolutely. It doesn't just have to be about painting bike lanes in the middle of the night. It's so much more than that. Because ultimately, when it comes to fixing anything in a city, it's going to take groups of people working together. This is actually what Strong Towns calls the bottom-up revolution as well, that ultimately all of this stuff needs to come from communities getting together, working together, and saying, like, no, this is what's actually important in our neighborhood. And I think it's great. Those group rides have been really fun. I've watched a few of them on your stream before, and it looks like a good time.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah, they're super fun. I love that group so much too. Everybody there is so full of positivity and energy. They're just ready to make anything happen. I love being around it. It's infectious.
Yeah, it's nice. It's better than doom scrolling and watching Not Just Bikes videos that make you depressed.
Actually, this is an interesting story that I would tell is that a lot of people, like the bike scene here in San Francisco has really changed a lot over the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And I'm noticing that a lot of people are getting into biking because they find out about urbanism and about car-free lifestyle through you.
Right.
They'll watch your videos and be super curious about it. They'll move to San Francisco because they want to start living a less car-dependent lifestyle.
Yeah.
And they'll be on transit all the time. They'll be walking all the time, but biking will be kind of on the periphery. They won't really be into it. But then the first time that they get on a bike will be one of these group rides. It might be like a slow street, slow ride, or it might be bike party or critical mass or something like that.
Yeah.
They'll be like, yeah, a group ride and a party. That sounds fun. I'll check that out. And then they just get sucked into bicycles and like the lifestyle and the community.
Yeah.
And then they're the number one biggest evangelists of the bike lifestyle after that.
I love that. I love that. I've heard that from Strong Towns as well, that there's a large number of people that find me or some other YouTubers and then go to their Strong Towns meetups. And then it all goes from there. And that's fantastic. That is one thing that I've always done with the channel. I've never tried to be very prescriptive. Obviously, we moved to the Netherlands, but I don't make videos that say, this is what you should do. I make videos that say, hey, you can live a better life by living in this kind of way. And here's why. And here's all the reasons that too many cars cause problems. And here's actually these things you never knew about bicycles and everything else. And then what people do with that information is kind of up to them. But I love it when people find out about those kind of things. That's great. That's a perfectly good path to go down.
Yeah. I mean, another great way to build community, right, is like putting content out there.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. It has been really interesting to see the growth of urbanism things in general, even since I started the channel, because there weren't nearly as many urbanist channels out there. I know some of them started because of my channel. Others, though, it was because of the pandemic. And I think as bad as that was, I think it helped urbanism quite a bit because there were fewer cars on the road and people saw that things could actually be better. And, they're trapped inside and they start to get this feeling for like, what's my neighborhood like? Like, what can I actually go and do? And it opened up people's eyes to it. And I think during that time, on the topic of tactical urbanism, at least the official kind, I know many cities took away parking spaces in order to build patios. so that there would be more outdoor seating for restaurants during the pandemic. And again, people saw those things and they're like, this is fantastic. This is great. Like, this is so much better than having this line of parked cars here. And I've noticed going back to Toronto, or when I went to Montreal last year, a lot of those are still around. And how are those doing in San Francisco?
It's a bit of a dramatic situation, I would say, constantly changing. Definitely the parklet program in San Francisco was very successful through the pandemic. And I read some numbers a while ago that showed San Francisco was like way ahead in approving parklets, like way ahead of LA and other West Coast cities. So we had a massive proliferation of parklets. Outdoor dining really exploded here in San Francisco. And it definitely was a huge help to the restaurant industry, which has been kind of struggling since the pandemic for sure.
Right.
But that honeymoon period ended a year or a year and a half or so ago because the mayor, I think this was a mayor thing, decided that we needed to start charging the businesses, money for those parklets.
Right.
And I was like, okay, yeah, maybe a few $1,000s a year for like the upkeep of the street or whatever it is. That makes sense. It turns out they wanted to charge like thousands of dollars a month for these parklets.
Jesus.
Yeah, which for a business who was getting that for free, first of all, and is now like kind of struggling, the restaurants, mostly benefited from those parklets. Now there were new regulations that were put on the parklets and they had to pay this monthly fee, and it was all very speculative. And so a lot of the parklets got destroyed and taken down and are back to parking spaces now. And in fact, the episode that we did, I think last time that we spoke, was about the merchants fighting against bike lanes.
Right.
Well, that merchant that we talked about specifically, the guy who was on a hunger strike, one of his talking points was that he wanted to keep his parklet, and the city was telling him that he, quote unquote, couldn't keep it, which I think means he wasn't willing to pay the money to keep it.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, it's a bit of a dynamic situation here in San Francisco and not a foregone conclusion. I don't know how it's going to end up.
That's sad to hear. I know we're kind of getting derailed here, but this is something I've noticed from many cities is that they charge for parking. And I certainly know this happens in Toronto because Toronto owns a company called Green P, which is the largest parking lot operator, second largest in the province. And all of that money comes into the city. So when you talk about removing parking for bike lanes or parklets or any of these other uses, there's a direct financial hit to the city because they've been dependent on that street parking revenue for so many years. And then that makes everything just cost more money in a sense, because now you have to say, okay, well, we're going to put in this bike lane, but now we're going to lose whatever it is, $50,000 a month for this street for the parking revenue. And that is just one more thing that gets in the way of things. But street parking needs to go. That's a whole other issue.
I've kind of wondered about that too, because like in San Francisco, and I assume this is probably pretty similar across most North American cities, a big chunk of the city's revenue comes from sales tax.
Right. That is not very common in Canada for what it's worth.
Oh, interesting.
For cities to charge their own sales tax is not a thing.
Yeah, okay. Because in San Francisco, we do have our own sales tax. And I think that's pretty typical across most of California, for sure.
Yeah, there's many U.S. cities that do that kind of thing.
Yeah. And like in theory, if a business owner does better because they have a parklet in front of their store, then that's more revenue for the city. And so, like, I guess I've just wondered how those numbers kind of work out. Like, does the city make more money by charging for the parklet, or are they making more money just by making the street more desirable and selling more goods along it,
You'd like to think that the second case would be true, and even if it wasn't, it makes the city better, and shouldn't that be what we're worried about? but I don't know.
Part of me it doubts that they've even put the numbers together on that stuff,
I suspect they have.
I think someone probably just is like shooting from the hip up at the top and is like, yeah, we got to start charging for that now, and then it just happens,
So what have you seen with some of these tactical urbanism things in San Francisco? You've said that the public transit benches seem to be sticking around. The street where the teacher was killed got torn up. What's been your experience of how many of these things stick around in their guerrilla form? How many get replaced with something official by the city? How many get just pulled out altogether?
Yeah, I don't have a list of all the installations that Safety Rebel has done. Obviously, no one has that list because it's too sensitive of information, although I know that someone has it. Or I should say, they keep it. It's just very locked down.
All right, fair enough.
But I know that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of these instances of little pieces of tactical urbanism that have been installed all over the city over the last several years. And the vast majority of them fly under the radar. No one talks about them. They're just there making people's lives better.
Right.
And it works. So the city, either they don't know about it or they don't care. It's the big visible things, the soft hit posts, like the planters in the street, the concrete signpost action. Like that stuff is a little more visible and a little more likely to be taken out by the city. But the little things, painting in a crosswalk where pedestrians can already legally cross the street, it's just not marked.
Right.
Like that's something that's relatively uncontroversial and will stick around for a while.
Right. They're not going to go removing that. They tend to remove things, I find, when you inconvenience car drivers too much.
Yes. Yeah, if someone who drives a car or owns a home complains about it, then that's when it gets taken out.
It's gone within seconds.
Yeah, exactly. You know, another thing that's been pretty successful is here in California, a law went into effect very recently. I think it makes every intersection, probably there's some constraints on this that I don't know of. Every intersection for, I don't know, maybe the first 20 or 30 feet has to be a no parking zone.
Right.
And that's for pedestrian daylight.
Yeah.
And it hasn't always been that way. Like I said, this is just a brand new law.
That should really be the case everywhere. It makes such a huge difference.
Yeah.
I mean, parked cars, there's so many problems with parked cars. I've talked about that in many videos, but especially near intersections. Cars should not be parking right at intersections because intersections are where almost all the crashes happen. And some of that is because you can't see behind a car that's parked there. So you can't see somebody crossing the street, a car coming, a person on a bicycle coming out of the intersection because the parked car is blocking their view.
Yeah. And so California has taken some steps, thankfully, to resolve that. But it's up to the local, municipalities, in our case, San Francisco, to like paint those curbs red and actually make it illegal to park there.
Right.
Because the California law makes it okay for the city to paint those curbs, but it doesn't make it illegal for anyone to park there, of course. It's up to the city to communicate the law.
Right. They have permission to do it, but they have to actually do it.
Yeah. And so in this case, like Safe Street Rebels identified an opportunity and they've painted a ton of curbs red around intersections, since that is what the California law says it should look like. And
Right.
So they just go ahead and do it. And SFMTA is not going to take those out because they are actually supposed to be red curbs now. And there's a whole program that they're doing research on to paint all the curbs that need to be painted. Safe Street Rebel just targets a few intersections that can really benefit from it today.
Right. And that's the case, is that with a lot of these guerrilla urbanism things, is that the people doing them know it best because they live there, right? They experience it all the time. They're the ones always riding their bikes there every day to go to work or school. And they're the ones that almost get clipped by a car because there are parked cars blocking their view. So these people know, and they know often better than the city knows, right? Because the city have their list of things that are important and the city have their priorities, but people at the city can't know every location.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where sometimes these things work better because the places that need them the most get fixed first.
Yeah, that community, right? You
Yes,
get to leverage
exactly
the
right.
community and the end result is always going to be better.
Yeah, absolutely. There were a few other examples that you had mentioned that I'd like you to talk about. I remember there was that whole thing at the Wiggle. What was all that about?
Well, so the Wiggle is one of the most trafficked bike routes in the whole city. And I'm not 100% sure I know exactly what the thing is that you're talking about because there have been so many actions there over the last several years. But I
Right.
think it's related to some soft hit posts that were installed. Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but as well as a stop sign protest, which was funny as well.
Yeah, we also did that. Yeah, I was there for both of those.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So like the Wiggle, extremely popular bike route. And for some reason, I will never understand why, because there's so many other options. There's like a subset of drivers that just drives it and thinks that they can go fast on it or whatever. There's like a park and a crosswalk in the middle of the road. And it's just not a place where you can drive fast. But some people are there expecting to be able to drive fast and they make really dangerous passing maneuvers, going up and down. I think it's like Scott Street there or something along those lines. So what Safe Street Rebel did is they took soft hit posts and they installed them periodically, like maybe every 15 feet or so for about a half a block or a block along the Wiggle. And it's just to show drivers like, hey, don't pass here. You just can't go fast. If there's a bike in front of you, just chill out. They're going to be gone in like half a block.
Right.
And it was a great traffic calming measure. I did get to ride it while it was there and it was lovely, but it only survived for like a few days because I think it was just a little too visible and a little bit too anti-car, as you pointed out.
Yeah. Whenever they slightly inconvenience car drivers, it'll be removed as soon as possible. Yeah. These were the ones in the middle of the street, weren't they?
Yeah, they were in the middle of the street. So they made it difficult for a car to get around a bicyclist and make it more difficult to do a pass.
Right. I've seen Toronto install some of those on purpose. And then some of them, the neighbors got angry about because it was in the middle of the street. What's this thing in the middle of the street? But they work incredibly well to put a flexi post in the middle of the street because even though the lane, it literally doesn't do anything to change the size of the lane at all. It's on the divider, the dividing line. So there is no narrowing of the street at all, but visually it looks much, much smaller. And that makes drivers drive slower all the time.
Yeah.
Anything that visually makes the street look narrower, they will drive slower. Because if there's one thing I've learned is that drivers may not care about running over people, but they really do care about their paint job.
I was just going to say the same thing. It's all about the paint job.
It is all about the paint job. It is wild how much drivers will slow down if they're afraid of scratching their paint.
Yeah, it really is so true.
Oh my God. There were a couple other examples that I wanted to talk about, and this is one that I've seen in Toronto as well, the people protected bike lane. So tell me about that.
Yeah, in my opinion, this was the most effective community event that San Francisco's ever had around protected bike lanes. Basically, the idea is you get a bunch of people. In San Francisco, it was like at least 100 people every time.
Right.
And they all show up at the same location at the same time. Everybody, in our case, we got T-shirts to wear. So we were all wearing matching T-shirts that said like people protected bike lane.
Nice.
And we would go stand on the white painted line between where the cars drive and where the bikes ride. We were creating a protected bike lane. It's just protected by people instead of by concrete. The proverbial meat shield if you're a gamer. And it was great. There were news helicopters up when we did it. Scott Wiener, our like state senator, or the senator here, like showed up, and we had various politicians come in and talk to people while they were in line or even stand in line with us. And I did a bunch of these. I did every single one that I could do. And I think I protested at like 6 different locations. And of that, probably about half of them have protected bike lanes today. The city put in concrete and actually built the protection where we were standing.
That's amazing.
Which is incredibly effective. I can't preach their effectiveness enough.
Yeah, honestly, that is something else. I know that was done in some places in Toronto that didn't have bike lanes yet, that the advocates had been arguing for years and years and years. Some of them were the painted bike lanes. Others were just like, there was no bike lane. So people went and stood out in the middle of the car lane and just, made a people protected bike lane. And again, like drivers will slow down. It's visually narrower. There's all these people there. They slow down. It is frustrating, though, how easy it is to get drivers to slow down, but we just don't do it.
Yeah, it's politically difficult. So you know what that means.
Yeah, I know exactly what that means. Do you have other examples that we want to talk about before we finish off here? I think we covered most of them.
I guess there's one other one from Valencia Street to bring up, which is the Just a Minute campaign.
Oh, right.
This one, I think, went pretty viral on social media when it has happened. It's on the State Street Rebel website, but I think it also was organized by the People Protected Bike Lane people. Basically, when you're a driver and you're going to leave your car in a bike lane, right. Valencia Street is notorious for this. There's a bunch of businesses there. Uber and Lyft drop-offs are happening constantly. There's like people going in to pick up food for deliveries or even just for themselves.
Right.
And they're just parking in the bike lanes. That's what they're doing. They put their flashers on and they just leave their car in the bike lane. And the line is, I'll just be a minute. It's just going to be a minute.
Just a minute, guy. Go around. Just a minute.
So what the Just a Minute campaign was, whenever someone parked in the bike lane, the group of advocates would basically just swarm their car and put up some signs. They would stand in the middle of the traffic lane next to the parked car and say, we're just going to be a minute. Just stop here and wait for a minute. And all the drivers would have to just stop and wait for this one person to get out of the store, come back with their food and drive off or whatever. And it was hilarious and it blew up on social media. That was a lot of fun.
That is good fun. That makes for some very angry drivers, but I approve of that. That is such bullshit, though. I've had that so many times. And you see it on social media, too, where somebody posts a picture. Now, when I used to do this more often before the Not Just Bike stuff, that's actually how the whole channel started, is I had this Twitter account where I used to just post bullshit happening in Toronto. And I would post pictures of, car in the bike lane, blocking the bike lane. And people are like, oh, it's just going to be a minute. Just drive around. Like, what's the big deal? And then it's like, oh, yeah. But so then a guy in Toronto just put his bike in the middle of the road, just parked it there, put the kickstand on and walked away. And he said, I'm just going to be a minute. And then he filmed it. And of course, people lost their fucking minds, right? They lost their fucking minds. Because if you delay a driver by even a few seconds, it is the worst thing possible in the world. But you park in the bike lane for 5 minutes. It's like, what's your big deal? Come on, just go out into traffic, even though it's dangerous. And people have literally been killed doing that. Just what's the big deal?
How long did that dude's bike survive, or was it immediately run over?
It was pretty quick, to be honest. Like, people were getting pretty angry. Because the thing is, when there's a group of people standing out there, it's hard for someone to run over people. But it's pretty easy for someone to just decide to run over your bicycle.
Yeah.
They do care about their paint job, but eventually they'll figure out a way to, knock it over and then just run it over.
Yeah, I'd have to pick a bike that I feel like I've gotten good usage out of before I do that. That way I can do that and just formally say goodbye to it,
Yeah, and film its demise and then use it for internet points. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Salute.
So I would love to see more of this happening. I love stuff like this. It's so good to see people come together and for them to kind of give the middle finger to the bureaucracy and to shine a light on this ridiculous hypocrisy that we have in North American cities, that car drivers can do no wrong and the money flows in like crazy and everybody else has to pick up the scraps and be happy with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I say, no, bullshit.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So I think to end off here, I would like to just say, like, this can be a lot of fun, even if you're not into doing the borderline legal, illegal things that we've talked about here. There are things that can be done for sure, and they are fun. Even the guerrilla gardening, everybody can do that. Go out, plant some flowers, make things better. But absolutely, I would say, like, there are almost certainly people, unless you live in an extraordinarily small city, there are almost certainly people out there who have that community that you can go join up with. And I know that we would do rides in Toronto and things like that. And it can be a lot of fun. And as depressing as it can be to live somewhere car dependent where there's a war on cars and the cars seem to be winning every battle, it helps to get together with other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we need to reach out to our community, find the other people who care about this stuff, and just hang out, even if it's not to kind of wreak any havoc, just to have some fun.
Yeah, exactly right. So who would you recommend that they check out in San Francisco? I know I'm not going to ask you to give a list for every city, but you know San Francisco.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to shout out Safe Street Rebel.
Yep.
SafeStreetRebel.com. Check out their website. They have tons of resources up there. Reach out to someone on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. They've got guides on how to install soft hit posts. They have guides on what like paint to buy and all these other things. They're an incredible resource. So definitely check out Safe Street Rebel.
Amazing.
I also want to shout out the Crosswalk Collective in LA for their amazing work. I think that they're a huge inspiration to the tactical urbanism and guerrilla urbanism community as a whole. So check out Crosswalk Collective. And specifically, I want to shout out Mingwei because of his work with benches and Daryl Owens, the two of them together installing benches in the East Bay. They're just such a non-controversial improvement that they've been able to bring and just bring the community together around these small infrastructure improvements. I think they're an amazing force for good. I love that it starts with individuals. And I think anybody who listens to this can look at that story and follow it as a blueprint for like their own journey.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much for that, John. It was a great conversation. It's always fun to talk about this stuff. So thanks again for coming on. And I'd recommend, if you don't know Bike Curious from Twitch, you should definitely check it out every Sunday. He live streams a ride in San Francisco or sometimes in some other places as well, but usually in and around San Francisco. And it's good fun. You can come along for the ride and chat with other people and see what it's like for John and where he cycles and what things are going on in San Francisco. I always like joining in because I did used to live in the Bay Area many, many years ago, and it's always nice to see how it's changed. So anyway, thanks a lot for coming on once again, John.
Yeah. Thank you for having me again, Jason. I always have a blast, so I'm looking forward to the next one.
Cheers. That's all we have on the agenda for today. I hope you enjoyed listening to it almost as much as we enjoyed making it. I really enjoy talking to other content creators about what they find interesting, and a lot of the people I have on this podcast I met since joining Nebula. Nebula is the subscription streaming service created by and for educational content creators and the people who love their content. Nebula has all sorts of educational content, from videos to podcasts to classes by your favorite creators, as well as Nebula Originals, which are high-budget productions. Honestly, Nebula is such a great platform, and I'm so happy for my content to be available there. If you use our special link, which is nebula.tv/agenda, you'll get a discount off an annual membership, which comes to only $30 a year, which I think is a fantastic deal. So check out Nebula at nebula.tv/agenda and see if there's something of interest to you. At the very least, you'll be able to hear every episode of the Urbanist Agenda a little bit earlier than everyone else, so you can get the inside scoop on what we're plotting and scheming. Thanks again for listening, and maybe next time you'll be listening on Nebula.